Thank you, John, for that brilliant and, as far as I'm concerned, 100% persuasive summary of the difference between two important British leaders. I want to talk about Mrs. Thatcher as a British political leader and as a person. And I want to start, rather as that film ended, with the funeral on the 17th of April 2013. Just about the same time, there was an opinion poll organized by the Sun newspaper. And it's worth remembering that Mrs. Thatcher had been, because of illness, entirely out of the public gaze for about 10 years. And so I think that one can say that people had had a chance to consider what they really thought of her. And they had experienced other prime ministers too. Well, the main findings of this poll were as follows. In answer to the question, who was Britain's best post-war prime minister, 28% said Thatcher, 24% said Churchill, 10% said Blair, and a generous 1% said Major. Other findings. It was thought that she stuck to what she believed, that she was strong and decisive. A relative majority, 48% to 35%, thought Britain was more prosperous. An absolute majority, 60%, thought that she'd made Britain more respected in the world. There were mixed views about whether Britain was more or less free. And a relative majority, 49% versus 25%, thought that she had left Britain less equal. The three most important criticisms at the time, of which that last was one, was, as I say, first of all, it was said that she had made Britain less equal. She might have done, she might not have done. These are statistical arguments which can be looked at from either side. But either way, it wouldn't have bothered her the slightest bit, because her aim was not to make Britain more equal. And she understood what we should all understand, that there is a logical incompatibility between pursuing equality on the one hand and pursuing liberty on the other. And if you want to pursue liberty, you are not going to be able to ensure equality. The second regards poverty. It was said that the poor had become poorer. Well, I really don't believe that is so. And again, an entirely fictitious statistical device is used to try to suggest that it is, and it is by relationship to something which is called the poverty line, and we hear and see it all over the place, really. Now, the poverty line, we should remember, is defined as 60% of median income. Median income. Now, think about that. What it means is that if those who are below that line, even if they've actually increased their wealth from one year to another, they may be classified as poor. In other words, it has absolutely nothing to do with absolute poverty. And the conditions under which we live relate to ourselves, not to our relationship with anybody else. It is an absurdity. The other thing that is said is that she was divisive. Well, I would say yes. I do not understand how anybody in any serious argument in public life could seek to be anything other than divisive about large issues. That's what democracy is about. If everybody believed in the same thing, we wouldn't have democracy at all. All great leaders are divisive. That doesn't mean that they should incite revolution. That's a different matter. But indeed, being clear about what you stand for is inevitably going to divide opinion. So I don't think that any of those criticisms I would consider criticisms at all, and I don't think that she would. There are other criticisms made now, interestingly, I think, on behalf of what is, or from what is generally called the new right. Now this, unless you're an aficionado, I have to explain to you, this is an umbrella term which covers different parties and movements which do not, in fact, always agree with each other. And this new right in Europe and America distrusts the Reagan-Thatcher free market economics. It regrets what it sees as the deindustrialization, which it believes is the result of her refusal to pursue an interventionist economic strategy. It sees the loss of social cohesiveness in the 1980s as too high a price to pay for economic advance. And it regards the transfer of power to global authorities as the counterpart of Reagan's and Thatcher's promotion of international open trading, and therefore it blames them for that transfer of power. Now, I think what we have to say here, first of all, is this. These people are simply not realistic about the threats which the world faced in the Cold War and the primacy of the need to defeat communism. And to suggest, as they do, that liberalism rather than socialism should have been the main army is simply childish. Not only is it childish in the West, it is profoundly offensive, or should be, to all those who live behind the Iron Curtain, and whatever their views were, they certainly wanted freedom. Nor do these criticisms take into account why the economy was, and after all, it's almost always going to be, why it was the main worry for most people, and thus the main issue on which elections were and will be, incidentally, won and lost. There is really not much point then or now in discussing how you might wish to change the world if you don't win power, and if you then don't stay in power long enough to do anything about it. And the most important thing about Margaret Thatcher, which really ought to be said, is that she managed to do so much good while winning 3 successive general elections. She never lost an election. She was in power for 11.5 years. She was the longest-serving British Prime Minister of the 20th century. She was a winner. Now, the world has certainly changed, but the proper purposes of government have not changed. And the essential nature of political leadership has not changed either. Mrs. Thatcher had a philosophy and a strategy. She was a believer in what Hayek calls the spontaneous order of a free society. This means that the outcome cannot be imposed, but it can be enabled, a very important distinction. And the work of government is to create a framework of sound money, limited borrowing, low taxes, and light regulation. It's to help those who genuinely cannot help themselves without encouraging what is indeed the scourge of dependence. It's to keep the country and all British territories safe from external threats and to prevent and repress crime. Now, this is an approach based on limited government. Government must be strong and effective, but it must not be large or intrusive. In fact, big government is universally bad government. So what did she think she had to do? Well, as I say, most of her time in government was spent on the economy. It had to be because of the dreadful conditions in which the British economy was. But she didn't in herself believe that economics was everything. She passionately believed in British greatness. And she knew there was no other way to make Britain great again, as the saying is, than to sort out the finances and to achieve economic growth. There was an obsession at that time, it's really difficult even for me to remember, let alone you to contemplate. There was an obsession with decline. What can be called declinism was the dominant mood among the political elite. Britain was derisively called the sick man of Europe. The so-called British disease undermined the country's sense of self-worth and threatened confidence in the Western model of free enterprise and democracy. And that model, we should recall, was itself under attack in the 1970s. Now, Britain's decline thus seemed to mirror that of the West. Decline was to be managed, not halted, let alone reversed. That was the accepted line, and she rejected it. Her approach consisted of the wholesale reversal of socialism in all its forms. Now, while the timing of measures had to be flexible, the overall direction was always fixed. This was completely the opposite of what previous Conservative leaders had done. By what was called the ratchet effect, Labour governments introduced more socialism, moving the ratchet to the left, which Conservative governments halted but never reversed. Then Labour came back, and so the ratchet went further left towards the end state of total state control, what we can best indeed ultimately logically call communism. Well, she reversed the direction of the ratchet. The scale of the obstacles was really huge. It was thought that no one could run the country without trade union agreement. It was said that no one would want to buy state-owned industries. Of course, we sold 44 of them. It was asserted that inflation and pay could never be kept down without legislative controls, what was called an incomes policy. The underlying, pervasive and highly dangerous attitude was that nothing could be done. Well, Mrs. Thatcher was temperamentally incapable of settling for that. She despised what she saw as a culture of excuses. Now, Keith Miles, I know, is going to talk about this reform programme, how it was carried out and the ideas behind it, so I shall say no more. I will, though, just say that she clearly did reverse decline. Now, the obvious measure of a country's economic performance is the growth of its GDP. Here, Mrs. Thatcher's achievement isn't in doubt. At the root of that improvement was the growth of productivity, which is always the root of everything that we have to be concerned with in economics. She was overwhelmingly successful, but the short-term pain was great. The short-term unpopularity was nearly fatal. She very nearly fell several times. Let's recall unemployment doubled. The unions nearly won during the year-long national coal miners' strike. She had to clear most of her cabinet out because they would not support her policies, and they then tried to clear her out. But they were neither brave nor well organized enough to do it. Little by little, it worked. New jobs, new businesses, more successful firms, growth, productivity, and so on. And the economic success became an example worldwide. It allowed Britain to stand with the United States in the Cold War and win the Falklands War with no increase in borrowing or taxes. No increase in borrowing or taxes in a 13-week struggle to win back the Falklands, which we nearly lost. Now, why was this possible? It wasn't just possible because of policies. It was because of one thing that itself made the policies possible, and that was because of her character. She always believed that character in politics is what matters in the end. Well, the fact of being a woman, I've got to mention it. I think one can overrate its importance. Sometimes it helped her. For example, she became a minister because of sheer tokenism, really, in the early 1960s. She then proved herself remarkably capable, but that was how it started. At the end, it was probably more of a hindrance in trying to keep the support of male cabinet colleagues, though who can say. What I would say is that she didn't believe that it was her job to advance the role of women, though she may have done so. She thought that women were as able as men, but many chose other tasks. She was firmly against quotas and reversed discrimination. Mrs. Thatcher's character was at one level simple, and at another, and when you look deeper, really rather complicated. She was, I must emphasize this, very clever indeed. Very clever indeed. She wasn't an intellectual. She didn't pretend to be. She quite liked the company of thinkers, but she was very, very clever. And she had an extraordinary head for figures, which she used to instill fear in ministers who tried to argue with her about matters like public expenditure or welfare. She could be very charming, as John will remember, and she was much more widely loved than anyone reading the accounts would imagine. She was personally kind, particularly to people of no social importance. She was financially generous too. But she could be, and sometimes was quite deliberately, I think, difficult, because she thought it kept people on their toes. More than that, her anger, when it came, was like an electric storm, and her temper, when it broke, was volcanic. This reflected a kind of exaggeration, in my view, in her personality, which may well be inseparable from those who dominate by force of character as she did. Though physically petite, she was a life force, and even in old age, as the saying goes, she filled a room. The truth is that many were afraid of her. Mrs. Thatcher was always taken with the idea of virtue. She liked talking about the Victorian virtues, not values, incidentally. And there are two of the four cardinal virtues, which, as you know, have nothing to do with cardinals, but to do with the word cardinal hinge, that I want to leave in your thoughts. The cardinal virtues are, of course, prudence, which is common sense, temperance, which isn't just about not having an extra glass of whiskey, but which is basically self-control, justice, which should be understood as fairness, and fortitude, which means courage. Well, these two, justice. Well, here I think one's got to distinguish personal from public. She was just in the sense of being honest and straightforward. And contrary to what is alleged, she was, for the most part, modest and even humble. Otherwise, she wouldn't have learnt so much and so quickly from such unlikely sources as to make up for her early deficiencies. She used to say to her advisers, "Don't worry, I have no toes," i.e., don't hold back for fearing you'll offend me. She was also just in that she believed strongly in fairness. Now, this, I think, is quite unusual on the right in politics. Conservative politicians usually believe in efficiency and order, but are inclined to switch off when questions of fairness arise. The left, who cannot or will not distinguish, no matter how often you explain the difference to them, between justice and equality, wouldn't, of course, have thought Mrs. Thatcher was at all interested in fairness either, but they're wrong. She thought that people had a right to keep what they earned without the state taking it. She thought socialism was unjust. She believed that people should be enabled to fulfill their talents. A system which blocked that was inherently illegitimate. And, very relevantly, she thought that stopping Croats and Bosniaks from defending themselves was unjust. Injustice angered her. Well, the fourth cardinal virtue is fortitude or courage. And this, I would say, was certainly her preeminent moral quality. She was extraordinarily brave. Now, here I must distinguish between moral and physical courage. Politicians always need the former, but if they're lucky, not too much of the latter. If I were to list the decisions and events in Mrs. Thatcher's political life that required exemplary moral courage, I just suggest the following. First, running for the leadership of the Conservative Party against Ted Heath in 1975, against all the odds and against her husband's advice, and then winning. Second, insisting in 1981 on a deflationary budget at the depth of a recession to get the public finances under control, defending the decision and sacking a large section of her cabinet to drive it through. In the autumn of 1980, she famously told the party conference, "The lady is not for turning," and now she proved it. Third, from start to finish, really, the Falklands War. Anyone who thinks that victory was inevitable there knows absolutely nothing of logistics. Mrs. Thatcher had physical courage. We should remember how keen the IRA, Irish Republican Army, terrorists were to kill her. And, of course, how many others they did manage to kill. They came nearest with the bomb that wrecked the Grand Hotel Brighton in the early hours of Friday, 12th of October, 1984. Had Margaret Thatcher been in the bathroom of her suite, she would have been dead. Instead, she was working, inevitably, I suppose, on her speech. She stayed completely calm. Her private secretary was appalled to see her, to the sound of falling masonry, walk back without hesitation into the darkened bedroom to check on her husband, Dennis. Her first thought was for others, and her second, by carrying on with the conference, was to show that the terrorist would not win. Now, two of Mrs. Thatcher's famous 19th century predecessors as Prime Minister expressed thoughts about each other which may, I think, appositely be applied to her. Lord Salisbury said of Benjamin Disraeli that, I quote, "zeal for the greatness of England was the passion of his life." And Disraeli, reflecting on the qualities of Salisbury, observed that, I quote, "courage is the rarest of all qualities to be found in public men." Well, Mrs. Thatcher had both patriotic zeal and extraordinary courage. Thank you.